Okay, let's try that again. Order. I call this meeting to order. This is the Standing Committee on Community Services, and I am Melissa Sheehy-Richard, the MLA for Hants West, and the chair of this committee, so welcome, everyone. Today, we will hear presenters regarding truth and reconciliation, language legislation, and treaty education. Just want to remind everyone to put their phones and other devices on silent. And in case of an emergency, I ask that everybody please use the Granville Street exit and walk up to Grand Parade. I will now ask committee members to introduce themselves for the record by stating their name and their constituency, beginning with MLA White.
Thank you, Chair. John White, I'm the MLA for Glace Bay Dominion. Nice to meet you.
Hi, good morning. Larry Harrison, MLA for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. MLA for Chester St. Margaret's.
Hi there, and thanks for being here. Tom Taggart, MLA for Colchester North.
Lisa LaChance, MLA for Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island.
Gary Burrell, Halifax, Shabukto.
Good morning, everyone. Laura Lee Nickel, Cole Harbour, Dartmouth. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I would also like to note for the presence of Legislative Counsel Karen Kinley and also the Legislative Committee Clerk Tamer Nusabi, and also Support Clerk Kim Leadley. I also like to welcome the witnesses again for joining us today, and I would ask them to introduce themselves as well, beginning with Mr. Huston.
Hi, my name is Justin Huston. I'm the Deputy Head or CEO for the Office of Ulnu Affairs, as well as the Deputy Minister responsible for Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage.
Hi, I'm Celeste Sulliman, and I am the Director of Treaty Education with the Office of Ulnu Affairs.
Good morning. My name is Nick Phillips, and I am the Treaty Education Policy Analyst at the Office of Ulnu Affairs.
At this time, I would welcome Mr. Huston to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Gway, and good morning. Before I get into my formal remarks, I just want to say thank you for inviting us here. We're very proud to share the work that we do, and we're very interested in having a dialogue with you this morning around any questions you might have about the work that we're doing. I'll also just say that I'm, like probably most in this room, I'm battling a cough for the past month, so if I have to stop and hydrate, forgive me. So I'm pleased to join you here today to talk about the work we're doing in partnership with Mi'kmaq on treaty education to support the Mi'kmaq language. Mi'kmaq culture adds so much to our province, and at the Office of Ulnu Affairs, we believe all Nova Scotians should have the opportunity to learn about our shared history, Mi'kmaq traditions, and the many contributions of Ulnu. We are all treaty people. Our partnership in treaty education is based on a Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in 2015 between the province, Mi'kmaq-Ginamatnawe, or MK, and Millbrook First Nation. It was updated and renewed indefinitely in 2020. Through the MOU, the Mi'kmaq and the province commit to develop treaty education programs and services. This effort is based on our shared goal, which is to help all Nova Scotians understand the treaty relationship and work toward meaningful reconciliation. Treaty Education Nova Scotia aims to increase knowledge and awareness by focusing on three main areas: public education, the provincial public service, and the general public. This work is led by an implementation committee that has representatives from MK, the Council on Mi'kmaq Education, Millbrook First Nation, and various provincial departments, which include, obviously, the Office of Ulnu Affairs, Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage, Education, and Early Childhood Development, as well as the Public Service Commission. After many ups and downs of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm pleased to say that treaty education in Nova Scotia is stronger than ever. Despite the recent challenges, we remain committed to making space for courageous conversations, to providing opportunities to learn and understand. Treaty education engages participants by asking 4 guiding questions, which we'll have an opportunity to circle back on this morning. Who are the Mi'kmaq historically and today? What are the treaties and why are they important? What happened to the treaty relationship? And what are we doing to reconcile our shared history to ensure justice and equity? By asking these questions, important dialogue is happening across the province. The number of Nova Scotians taking part in treaty education is growing. As more educators and students get involved, there is also interest in the broader community, including businesses and community organizations, which I'm sure many of you are aware of and have fielded conversations or phone calls about. More and more public service employees are also taking part. In the last 18 months, several learning opportunities have been developed for this group. These include learning circles and department-specific workshops, as well as the Kairos blanket exercise. Since its launch in May 2021, over 400 public service employees across the province have participated in the workshop called Understanding the Treaty Relationship through online learning. Madam Chair, I would like to mention an important but difficult part of our shared history in Canada, residential schools. The past 2 years have been particularly challenging with the uncovering of children's bodies at former school sites across the country. This devastating news has been made many people aware of intergenerational trauma and systemic racism here in Canada and Nova Scotia. There is recognition of the impact still being felt today, including in Ulnu communities. As we continue to share truth, we reconcile our collective history. We make space for reconciliation. All of us here today acknowledge that Mi'kmaq culture and heritage, including language, are important to Mi'kmaq communities. They are important to all Nova Scotians. That's why our partnership with the Mi'kmaq includes working together to promote and preserve Mi'kmaq language. As part of this effort, the Mi'kmaq Language Act received royal assent in April, with support from all parties, thank you, in the legislature and Mi'kmaq partners. The Act recognizes Mi'kmaq as the original language of this land. It commits the province to work closely with the Mi'kmaq to revitalize the language. The legislation was proclaimed by the province and affirmed by the Mi'kmaq during a ceremony on July 17th in Botlekek First Nation. The Act came into effect recently on October 1st, Treaty Day, which all of you will remember. Work is now underway to establish a language committee that will include representation from Mi'kmaq leadership and educational and other organizations. Each of the 13 Mi'kmaq communities will also be involved directly. The group will lead the development of an action plan to support Mi'kmaq language in the short term and for future generations. This language strategy will be something to celebrate as we continue to move forward on our commitment. Madam Chair, working with our Mi'kmaq partners on treaty education and Mi'kmaq language has made our relationship with one another stronger. It has helped build mutual understanding and advances reconciliation. While progress is being made, there is also much more to do. Thank you to the committee again for inviting me here and my colleagues here today, and I would be pleased, as well as my colleagues, to answer any questions you may have. Olaliak, thank you.
Thank you. We'll proceed into our round of questioning, and this committee functions with a 20-minute question period for each caucus. I just want to remind everybody to wait until their name is called and I recognize you and your mic turns red before speaking. And at the end of the 20 minutes, we will have to cut you off mid-sentence. Those who have been here before know that. So at this point, I invite someone from the Liberal caucus to begin. Ms. MLA Nicol.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chair. And I would just like to thank you for being here and your presentation. I was kind of waiting for the other two to sort of speak as well, but I will direct some of my questions and welcome you to answer them in that regard. The bill came into effect that you just spoke of in the fall, and we're just wondering about the progress you just mentioned. I had action plan written here on my note, and you actually said action plan. So my first question is to know more about the action plan. When might we see that, and where could we find it? So that's to add to that.
Mr. Huston.
Thank you for the question. So the work is underway right now. So for some of these things, the output is as important as the process and the journey. So we're working very closely with our Mi'kmaq partners to design the process, and we're working hand in hand. So my executive director at Ulnu Affairs, Ian Bauer, is working directly with Blair Gould at MK, and they are chairing this implementation committee, this language committee that is working. So they've already started to do the work on the MK side, of working and connecting with each community. So the idea right now is we've got a draft terms of reference, and we're building the membership right down to the individual level. And so I'm hopeful that in the coming months, after the holidays, we'll have a finalized terms of reference, we'll have the membership, and so we'll be able to get underway in the spring with regular meetings to build that action plan.
Ms. Nicol.
Thank you for that, and I understand the extensive work that has been done and where you are now, so I applaud you on that. But I was just wanting to switch now to elaborate on how you're addressing treaty education at a post-secondary level. Like the 2017 outlines it speaks in a very structured way on the pre-to-12 curriculum, and however the memorandum of understanding with the university speaks to treaty education in a much broader way. So I just wondered what concrete progress has been made within the university system.
I'll start with that.
Mr. Huston?
I knew I was going to do that today. I do that all the time. I just get excited to answer the question. So, no, thank you for that question. I'll start with an answer, and then I might hand it to Celeste, I think, for some of the work that you've been doing with some of the universities. So, essentially, our work is to provide sort of a help support and overall information and guidance. But really, the universities have been taking this on their own, and they've all taken some different approaches. There's some consistencies. But they're all looking, in some ways, I think, what is really exciting is that they're all seeing it as an important way that defines their identity as universities, and in some ways a competitive edge. They realize that they need to develop these programs to serve their students that are Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and they're stepping up, and they've created some work, I think, across universities where they're working together. But interestingly enough, in some ways, they've been a bit siloed because they see it as they're all trying to get into that space and do it their own way based on their own culture at their universities. So I'll let Celeste speak to that in any more detail if you have any.
Ms. Sulliman?
So we do work somewhat with universities. Most of the focus of treaty education of Scotia is on the P to 12 curriculum and focusing on P to 12 teachers. But some of the work that we do is in response to some of those universities coming to us to look for either resources or really help for us to provide them with some sort of navigation services, some facilitation services, kind of link universities and communities together. Some of the universities are doing some really great creative work as a result of some engagement with Treaty Ed. Just recently, a university announced an Auntie in Residence program, which is a very unique program. Another is that a number of them have Mi'kmaq education coordinators that will help both the faculty and the students sort of navigate the treaty education information. And some of them even have elders in residence. So the universities are doing some really great work. It's a little bit beyond our scope to prescribe the work that these academic institutions do, but there's both great academic work and great student service work being done by the universities to educate people on the treaty relationship.
I'll just take a moment and let MLA Jessam introduce himself to the committee for Ledge TV purposes too.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I tried to sneak in here without too much notice. Excuse my tardiness, folks. I'm Ben Jessam, and I represent Hammonds Plains Lucasville. Thank you all for being here.
And Ms. Nickel.
Thank you once again. And I just wanted to that point, everyone is very interested in learning the language, so leaving the initiative to universities, but there's also the desire by Nova Scotia adults to learn the language. And there's also the opportunity with NSCC, so that I'm going to go into my next question in that regard, but you can answer it when you respond. But as an MLA that has a reserve within the Cole Harbour Dartmouth, how can we sort of integrate the principles of treaty education in our own communities, and what could we do? Because there is a desire from the general public wanting to know more, but right now the reserve is kind of like a standoff, kind of like approach, and they're sort of like, I don't know how to do it. And it's very much like education when you have students that want to learn but don't know, how to approach that. So I just wondered if there was something that we could do to improve that relationship So, I mean, I have the Office of Atlantic Policy Congress is right there at the reserve. So, you know, I've been there. I used to be a former municipal councillor, so I created that relationship. But then now provincially, that relationship is sort of like, I don't know whether to approach or not. So I just wondered what we could do and how you could facilitate in that regard.
Mr. Huston.
Again, I'll start with an answer to that, but I think I'll hand it over to Celeste and Nick to give us some examples of some of the work that is happening at the community level. So, no, I think that's the fundamental, that's the key thing, is the curiosity and the desire. And I think that's the foundation that really treaty education must build upon. And so the work that we're often doing is about sparking that interest, but often that interest already exists. And then it's about how to provide safe places, good information, good process to have those conversations and to make those community connections. So it's the key is, like anything, is everybody, you know, the Mi'kmaq communities are all different. You know, it isn't a homogeneous group of individuals. Like everybody's individuals, different communities, just like across Nova Scotia. And so I think it's really important for MLAs and community leaders to understand that, you know, there are folks we're all in the same communities, and it's those family connections, it's those people that you see at the store, at the gas station. But what I think what treaty education can help to do is help to have those conversations in a way that it allows the non-Indigenous partners in that to come to a conversation where it isn't putting all the emphasis and the weight on our Indigenous community members to hold that space for it. Like, we have the work to do as non-Indigenous allies. And so maybe I'll hand it over to Celeste and or Nick to identify examples of some of the work that we do, whether it's Speakers Bureau or it's some of the different things that we can do at the community level.
Ms. Sullivan.
So I love that you raised that point, because most often that's the question that we get from individuals, is that how can I do this? It's very simple and it's very complex all at once. So what we really work to do in treaty education is to create understanding, to kind of fight against racism, but to talk a little bit about the truth of our shared history, which for a lot of people is very painful and difficult to both talk about and to hear. And we're really all about building relationships. I mean, that's really key, and that, I'll say that's the foundational piece to treaty education, is building relationships. And when we talk about building those relationships, we talk about building those based on curiosity, also based on intention, and authenticity. And so when we engage people in treaty education, no matter what audience we're dealing with, we always ask people to take a look at what their intentions are, take a look at the value that you place on the relationship, and just be curious and be authentic in approaching people who are in Olnu communities and Indigenous people who are living in the urban population. So we do a lot of work with communities through our Speakers Bureau that we have. And so community organizations, sometimes it's individuals in communities or in organizations will come to us and they'll want learning. And we can't do all the teaching. We can't facilitate all the groups, but we can help people navigate communities in order to connect with individuals within communities so that people can build relationships. So we have access to a really open and knowledgeable group of elders, knowledge holders, educators in Olnu communities, and through the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, where we can match people in community with people who are curious and who want to learn. And so there are some kind of formal ways to do that, and we also just encourage people to just build those authentic relationships. If it feels right, we say, enter into the space, which sometimes can feel awkward, but gets easier as we build the relationship.
Thank you for those comments. Mr. Phillips, did you have something you wanted to add as well, or?
Thank you, Chair. I would specifically like to just talk about our Speakers Bureau and understanding that, it's something that we have actively been working on, and not as owners of the Speakers Bureau, but as stewards of the Speakers Bureau in building those relationships, in understanding that Mi'kmaq communities are not homogeneous, that communities are different, they have their own experiences, and so we use the Speakers Bureau as a intersection in being able to build capacity and relationships in that regard. So that's what I would like to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nicol.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, and thank you for that, Nick. That's I need to delve more into what the Speakers Bureau does in that regard, so what I could do to facilitate, because I know I hear from both sides. They say anything you can do to help us. I hear that from the Millbrook people, and so therefore I'd be more than happy to do that. And in that regard, and as you're speaking there, and every time you say the new affairs, for years I kept saying, why are they calling it the Office of Aboriginal Affairs? Like, it was just, that so needs to change. So it's music to my ears to not hear that anymore and say that. But also, I just wanted to add that I have met with the Reserve people, and they talked about Truth and Reconciliation many times, and it was they that met with me and wanted to make Treaty Day, Truth and Reconciliation Day, an actual holiday, but they still have the desire to have it a statutory holiday, and wondered if that was in part of your action plan, or if that is something that has to go down a different path.
Mr. Huston.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So that isn't specific to treaty education and the work that we're doing, but there are conversations being had with relevant departments around exploring whether that could be a statutory holiday. So we do recognize, Canada recognizes it, while the province doesn't recognize it as a statutory holiday. It's certainly something that we're considering. And I should also note, too, that our Mi'kmaq partners and leadership have often, prior to Truth and Reconciliation Day, which the federal government created as a holiday, previously had called for Treaty Day, which is October 1st, instead of September 30th, to be a holiday to recognize that treaty relationship. So, there's some convergence there, I think, around that, and I think we've seen that over the last couple of years with the new federal holiday, and looking at ways that it can tie into what has been always more important here in Nova Scotia, which is October 1st, which is Treaty Day.
Thank you. MLA Jessom.
Thank you kindly, Madam Chair. How much time do I have remaining?
5:20.
5:20. Okay, perfect. Thank you, folks. Appreciate your time and efforts here this morning. It's important work, and it's just nice to see government and governments taking steps to advance these types of initiatives. I'm wondering how treaty education ties into service delivery for government, be it, I guess we're probably talking about a broader scenario, but given the nature of this particular committee, we're talking about community services. And I'd like to know how treaty education fits into a better situation for our Mi'kmaq and broader population with respect to service delivery.
Mr. Huston.
So I think that's a great question, and thanks for making the connection too. So it really is critical. We look at, when we talk about ensuring that all Nova Scotians receive the level of service and program delivery that they need. It's important, and we talk about being culturally appropriate in terms of meeting people where they're at, and we know that Indigenous peoples and communities, African Nova Scotian, immigrants, other marginalized communities don't always receive the same level of service, because the system might not be able to reflect who they are, or how they need their services delivered. So a fundamental part of treaty education is helping the people that are delivering the services understand that treaty relationship and understanding the unique cultural, historical background of the people that they're working with, understanding things like intergenerational trauma. And so it is a foundational piece. What I would say is that the treaty education work lays a groundwork, and then we have other programs. So, Celeste had mentioned sometimes we will do work specifically with certain departments, and we will, whether it's through the Speakers Bureau or it's having specific sessions that we will tailor for, say, Department of Community Services or Natural Resources that speak to the work that they're doing and help put in the context of treaty education. And then there's work that the departments will do on their own, either with our office at Old New Affairs that is a little bit different from treaty education, but it's a critical part of how we're trying to transform really the public service in terms of meeting the needs of all Nova Scotians. And this is that foundational level of information so people can understand and they can get a bit better perspective before they have those conversations on the phone or they're trying to deliver programs and services.
MLA Jessom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does your department, and by extension other departments in government, do they have, perhaps use the word targets in terms of annually we want to ensure that this many people within our broader public service are engaged in this type of education? Are there specific strategies within respective departments to facilitate this type of work? Can you comment on anything that's, I would say, structurally definitive within like a strategic plan scenario?
Mr. Huston.
Thanks for that question. So there are a few answers to that. So I'll try to cover off, and if I don't, let me know. So we don't have specific targets in terms of number of, say, public servants that are taking the training. It's not mandatory. We can speak to some of the numbers in terms of those that have participated. Different departments, based on the work that they do, have already in place and or are in the process of developing specific either units or staff that are focused particularly on working with Mi'kmaq and Indigenous communities and individuals here in the province. So for example, education has, what's the name of the branch? The Mi'kmaq Services branch. At NRR, Natural Resources and Renewables, there's certain staff that are dedicated just to working with the Mi'kmaq on various programs and projects. And so a lot of the work that they do is work with the Office of Old New Affairs because we're sort of a coordinating hub of an office. There's only 17 of us. So a lot of our work is working with those departments to help them do their work with the Mi'kmaq in a way that's culture appropriate, but also looks at, we're trying to shift the idea of like it's not a, and you definitely don't want to use the word stakeholder, it's not an interest group that we're working with. We're working with rights holders in many Milu, and it's a partnership. And so it's changing the way that we do that work. And so many departments have already adopted that or are in the process of building that out more.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So we will now move on to the NDP Caucus and MLA LaChance.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. And I guess I wanted to start off, and this might not be a direct question to you, but you can comment on it if you'd like to. As members would know, as the chair would know, I don't normally sit on this committee, and so I was excited to come for this topic, but I was also just a bit concerned that we didn't actually have any representation from MK or from Millbrook speaking today. So. And so I don't know that you want to comment on it, but I think it's just super important to have, to not talk about Indigenous folks without Indigenous folks representing communities at the table.
Mr. Huston.
Yep. So thanks for that question. So they were absolutely were invited to participate, but were not did not feel like they could make it work given timing and schedule. So we made them aware that we were invited. They're certainly open to participate, but they chose not to at this time. And I think it is important. We certainly nothing about us without us is kind of the approach. And so they were certainly invited as partners. And I would say is that all the work that we're talking about doing, and I want to emphasize this, when it comes to treaty education in Nova Scotia is a banner. And any of the work that comes under that banner is done in partnership with the Mi'kmaq. So when we talk about the work that is happening, we have a strategic plan, we have an annual work plan that we work out with our Mi'kmaq partners, and we are responsible for delivering certain aspects of it, and they are as well within their school system or in their communities, but it is something that we have worked out together. This is what we're going to focus on for the next year, next 5 years. So what we're talking about here, when we say treaty education in Nova Scotia, I think it's important just to emphasize there's the work that our office does, but the Speakers Bureau, everything, it is done in conjunction with our Mi'kmaq partners.
MLA LaChance.
And I think perhaps you started to answer my next question, but I was wondering, you referred to since 2020 that the MOU is indefinite. And so how is that implemented in a practical sense, so annually, and how is progress marked through the MOU process?
Mr. Huston?
So thanks for that question. So to go back a little bit, if you'll bear with me a little bit, and this isn't to eat up the clock, I think it's just good background information. So the work that we're doing in treaty education is modeled after some work that has been happening for decades, really, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And it was a partnership between the First Nations Assembly of different provinces, different groups, and the federal government. And in Nova Scotia, we took a different approach where it was really the province working in partnership with Mi'kmaq to develop our own approach to treaty education. And we even the term "we're all treaty people," that is a term that's borrowed from out west, and and the way they said it was, we're very honored that we came out there to learn from them, and it's their job to kind of pass it on, and we're having these similar conversations with our colleagues in PEI and other provinces, so that are looking to build from a Nova Scotia. So we signed this MOU in 2015. And it was, I think, for 5 years, or it was every 3 years renewable. And in 2020, we decided to renew that. And rather than putting a date on it, it would be indefinite. There's always those caveats if either party wants to pull out, but we don't foresee that happening. But as you can imagine, an MOU is quite high level, and it identifies some big thematic areas, but it doesn't get down into the details of what are we going to do. So that's where the implementation committee comes in. And there's a strategic plan, and there's annual work plans that we identify in terms of who's doing what are our goals. And, we try to be flexible and adaptive because that's the name of the game, but that's how we kind of keep track. And there is, at a senior level, although we haven't been able to meet because of COVID, but there are a number of chiefs, myself and other deputy ministers that would meet on an annual basis, or more frequently if needed, to review the progress and to provide direction and advice in terms of how to keep moving.
Thank you. MLA LaChance?
So you talked about the Mi'kmaq Languages Act, which I think, was certainly very important and had all party support, as you noted. I think at the time that we were considering that in the legislature, I talked about the importance of language to really understand where we are and who we are. So we're very excited to see that work start. What is the budget this year for work related to that act?
Mr. Huston.
So the budget for this year, there is no budget assigned to that for the work. Now, there's funds that we're utilizing just to kind of get the committee going, but basically we have said we need the committee to meet, come together to pull together what the plan is, and sketch out what the actions are so that we can then fund appropriately. The federal government has dedicated significant dollars. I think, I could be wrong on that, it's either $500,000 or I think it went up to $1 million to work on language initiatives in the province directly to MK. And so We're looking to make sure that any work that we do is not duplicative, that it can leverage those dollars, and that it can be used most effectively and efficiently. And so we're looking for essentially that committee to come together to recommend, here's what the approach should be, and here's what we think the province should, and then we'll make our assessment and decisions from there.
MLA Lachance.
More. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Emily Burrell. So you spoke of the emphasis, and this might be a question for Ms. Sullivan, on P to 12 treaty education. And I'm wondering, how is that work evaluated?
Ms. Sullivan.
Okay, thanks for the question. The work that's being done in P to 12 education, both in MK schools and in the Nova Scotia public schools, is being led specifically by Mi'kmaq Ginamundwe and EECD. And the Mi'kmaq Services Branch at EECD is the primary branch of EECD that's leading that work. So Nick and I do collaborate with those two groups to support projects on creating resources, teacher training and education, events, and facilitating presenters in schools for students. And I'll say a number of other activities. The list is really quite long, the number of pieces that we're engaged in. What I can say is that the focus right now is on creating some resources for both students and for teachers, because one of the things that I think we have to realize is that we can create all the resources that we want for the children in the schools, and the teachers who are teaching that curriculum have not received that same education. And so what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that new teachers embedded in their curriculum is work on the treaty relationship and on understanding the complexities around things like residential schools and centralization and enfranchisement and those issues that we talk about in Treaty Ed, and so there's lots of teacher in-services that are done in order to ensure that teachers are able to educate the students and deal and help the students navigate some of the work. If I can share, we have a celebration this week. We co-created in a very complex way, because nothing is really simple in treaty education. It's very complex. But the province, working with MK and working with Bouton d'Or Acadie, a press in Moncton, New Brunswick, we created a resource called it's the Honor Song. That resource is a story leveled for like grades 4 and 5 that is about the creation of the Honor Song, which is a very sacred song in Olnu culture, and it's in English, French, and Mi'kmaq. And so we're getting to celebrate the launch of that. So in terms of measuring the success right now, what we're doing is, we're starting small. I say we're eating the elephant one bite at a time. And we're trying to slowly introduce resources, concepts like Etawamtamunk, Nedugulimk into the school curriculum, both in Olnu schools and in public schools. And we're trying to do teacher training.
Mr. Huston.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Celeste and to your question specifically as well, is I think what's pretty that I want to emphasize is the work that happened, particularly with EECD and MK, is that they have woven into so teachers teach to curriculum outcomes, right? And that is probably the biggest measure. And so woven into every class, every grade, are curriculum outcomes that relate to treaty education. So if you're in second grade, or let's pick sixth grade math, there will be elements of treaty education or Mi'kmaq curriculum outcomes woven into it. So this isn't like in the past where you might have a grade 10 class in history on the Mi'kmaq or about, that this is woven throughout. So if anybody has kids or grandkids here, you will know that starting in pre-primary, primary, they're hearing the honor song. Second grade, they're starting to understand what it means to have a partnership and a relationship. And so it's age appropriate, and it scales all the way up to the time that they're going to be graduating from grade 12. Mm-hmm. And so specifically to your point is that they will be graded on those outcomes. Teachers will be held accountable to those curriculum outcomes, which include aspects of treaty education built right in. We wanted to make sure that it was built right in. So all that work happened with Mi'kmaq partners, with folks I think at St. FX and others that are specialize in the pedagogy. So I've got two educators here. University professor, Nick, you were director of education at Millbrook, right? Yeah. So they'll do the education talk, but it's pretty amazing what we've been able to do, and it's very unique across the country. Like, you don't see this anywhere else in the country.
Mr. Phillips, did you want to add to that as well, or? Okay. Where are we? MLA Burrow.
Thanks. And at what time do we need to conclude?
There's 8 minutes left.
Yeah, great. Look, I wanted to, a little more broadly, think about the TRC and where we are on the calls to action in Nova Scotia. One of them that speaks so clearly the provincial jurisdiction is the whole question of disproportionate incarceration, and the call there not just to eliminate that, of course, but also to develop a reporting mechanism by which we can see how we are moving out of this terrible disproportionate situation. Where are we in Nova Scotia on a reporting mechanism towards the accomplishment of this goal?
Mr. Huston?
So thanks. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the TRC and the 94 calls to action. It's something that we've been working on prior even to its release, and since the release of the calls to action, we have been tracking our progress on the various items. So you're absolutely right. There is a disproportionately high number of Indigenous folks that are attached to our justice system and are incarcerated. And there is work underway. So the short answer is that we are reporting on the numbers. We have a sense of what those numbers are. I don't have them here. And there is a number of efforts underway in terms of looking at ways to reduce that incarceration. So some examples of some of those are, so let me back up and say the work Justice is working on with Mi'kmaq partners on an Indigenous justice strategy that will look at how to prioritize and frame some of this work. But there's a lot of work that's already going on. So everything from looking at programs, say at the end of the pipe in prisons, that looking at correctional officers that are from community or that have the cultural training and background to work with community, to backing it up to things like restorative justice. So looking at so rather than a pipeline into incarceration, are there other ways, traditional ways of looking at, whether it's the court in Wagmatcook and the Gladue court system, where it's looking at alternative resolutions versus incarceration, and then backing it up even further at looking at, so there's work that's happening, tripartite conversations, negotiations that are happening around programs like social income assistance on reserve, and looking at ways of how do we have a more of a wraparound where the family and the individuals are at the center, and we're looking at full care in all programs and services so that we avoid people falling through the cracks, and then even backing it up even further into youth and looking at making sure that they see themselves having a place in society and in the economy. If you're in community and you're looking at say Eskasoni, where you've got a 70% child poverty rate, you need to be able to see what your options are going forward. So a lot of the work that's happening at MK, with the work that we're doing in economic development and training with the NSCC, is looking at, are there opportunities for youth there in terms of the broader society and growing our economy, because it's key to all of Nova Scotia and success, but particularly for those communities.
MLA Burrow.
Thanks. I think there's a pretty broad agreement that we are not one of the most advanced jurisdictions in the country on this front. I mean, when the TRC came out, and at that stage, we were one of the few provinces that actually didn't even have statistics on disproportionate administrative confinement. Do we still not have those statistics? Do we know about Indigenous populations and solitary confinement yet?
Mr. Huston.
I don't have an answer to that question, but that is something that I can follow up with. So we'll make sure that we provide information back to the committee on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
MLA Burrell. I didn't have mine
Good.
on either.
Thank you. Just about the TRC. So that key recommendation about adopting UNDRIP. You know, there are other parts of the country that have seen this as an important thing to do. The TRC thinks of it as an important thing to do. Are there discussions within the government? Are there discussions within your work about moving towards this goal? Where are we on the adoption of UNDRIP?
Mr. Huston.
Thanks for the question. So I'll provide a little bit of context as well. But I'll start with answering your question directly, and I'll provide some context. So there's currently no discussions underway right now around formally adopting UNDRIP in legislation or otherwise. What I would say is that the work that we do, whether it's in consultations or negotiations or treaty education otherwise, is very consistent with all the principles of UNDRIP. But we're not in formal conversations around something like, say, British Columbia has done, where adopting their own legislation UNDRIP. I'll point back to the context around the TRC. When the TRC came out and it had 94 calls to action, we have in Nova Scotia something called the Tripartite Forum, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's an organization that has existed for over 20 years, and it came together basically as a way to solve problems collectively between the Mi'kmaq, the federal government, and Nova Scotia around whether it's injustice, education, sport and recreation, whatever it might be. And we brought that forum together. When I say we, all partners, led by the Mi'kmaq, and held a symposium chaired by Senator Christmas to look at ways to prioritize those 94 calls to action in Nova Scotia. And so it was a 2-day session that we held up in Member 2, and it was basically hearing from folks, leadership in community and across the 2 levels of government around where to prioritize. And the areas that we've prioritized were things like around health, is a good example, some work around treaty education, education broadly, economic development. So of those calls to action, we probably had about 7 or 8 which were seen as priorities by the chiefs, which we've been acting on as a party. Now we're due to go back and recircle back the Tripartite Forum around what some of those priorities might be in a check-in. But I wanted to provide that context, is that we're really following the lead of that Tripartite Forum and that process in terms of where like, for example, discussions around a Mi'kmaq Health Authority, Dajigamic, that is well underway with the federal government and ourselves around looking at ways to advance that. Things like social income assistance, some of the work around recognizing truth and reconciliation around sort of a monument of residential schools, some of the work that's going on there.
You have 30 seconds, MLA Burrell.
There's only one call to action in a provincial jurisdiction about language and culture. That is the elimination of provincial fees for people who wish to change their names to pre-colonial forms. Where are we on that?
We've already done that.
I didn't know. It's wonderful.
Mr. Huston.
We've already done that.
Perfect timing. Order. We will now move on to the Progressive Conservative Caucus. MLA White.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Huston, in your opening remarks and throughout the day as well, you've mentioned a few government departments and Mi'kmaq partners that are working on treaty education in Nova Scotia. Can you take a few more minutes to tell us how these partners work together and maybe describe some of the accomplishments that they've had over the last year, please?
Mr. Huston.
Just just had a little huddle there. So I will thank you for the question. I'll talk about communities, culture, tourism, and heritage, which is conveniently is the portfolio I also hold. And then I'll hand it over to Celeste, who can share a little bit about the work at the Public Service Commission as well as education, which we've touched upon quite a bit actually already. So communities, culture, tourism, and heritage, we are a key partner in the treaty education initiative. We have staff that sit on the implementation committee. And really, going back to the Culture Action Plan 5 or 6 years ago, woven right into that plan was a focus on Mi'kmaq culture and language and arts. And so it is really infused into the work that we do in the department. We're seeing that we pilot a lot of the initiatives that might be coming out of treaty education. We're kind of a testing ground or incubator for some of the work that might happen. If you've had a chance to go to the Museum of Natural History recently or the Museum of the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, you will see Mi'kmaq culture and language on full display in brand new exhibits, and we're actually working on one that will a new exhibit at the Museum of Natural History that will happen, I think, next fall. That's we've worked very closely in partnership. So, you know, a lot of the work that we do, again, is nothing about us without us. So Roger Lewis, who is a very well-respected Mi'kmaq ethnographist, I believe, related to archaeology and cultural heritage at the museum, and he's a member of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council as well. He's been leading a lot of that work. So that's an example of some of the stuff that's happening at CCTH. I'll also say that CCTH worked in partnership with OLA in the development of the language legislation. And so we will be there in partnership as a department with OLA on all of these initiatives.
Ms. Sullivan.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll talk just a little bit about the work that our partners at EECD and at the Public Service Commission are engaged in. And I'll start with the Public Service Commission. So we work really closely with with our colleagues in the People and Culture Division, who essentially lead a lot of the training in equity, diversity, and anti-racism. And so we're in the process right now. So I think earlier you learned that Nick and I co-developed and we co-deliver a course called, or a workshop that's called Understanding the Treaty Relationship. And that workshop's an 8-hour workshop. It's quite intense. And it takes a lot for Nick and I to, deliver that and for people to take it. So we are working really closely with the Public Service Commission in order to address the need for people to be able to access that a little more readily. And so we're working on an online self-directed version of that course so that people from all across the province, no matter whether you sit at a desk or whether you drive a snowplow, that you have access to that course. And we're trying to do it in a culturally sensitive way, but also a way that will make it more accessible to more individuals. So between that and then some of the work that is being done in anti-racism and at the Learning Center, for example, the Learning Center hosts and helps us enroll and coordinate Kairos blanket exercises for public service employees across government. We just held one last week at the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center hosted us, and we had close to 40 public service employees from departments all across and from different areas, different regions all across Nova Scotia come and join us for that learning session at the Friendship Center. And then, of course, I've spoken about some of the work that EECD is doing, but essentially the work that's coming out of Mi'kmaq Services Branch on treaty education is really, it's pivotal and it's foundational to all the work that we do. So all of the resources that they help create and curriculum pieces are foundational pieces for the work that we do. And I'll also share that they just recently, EECD just hired a woman by the name of Sharon Bernard, who is the reconciliation coordinator, and she specifically is there to increase learning around residential schools, and so that's those are some of the pieces.
Thank you. MLA White?
Excellent, thank you. I'm probably going to ask you to elaborate a little more, because when we looked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, we noticed that Action 57 speaks to federal, provincial, and municipal governments providing education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools. This action also requires skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism, much of the stuff that you've already talked about. So can you share with the committee, or maybe elaborate a little more on some of the specific work that's being done on the treaty education to address this call?
Mr. Phillips?
Chair. So specifically to talk about some of the stuff that we're doing, first and foremost, we have definitely heard from our public service colleagues in some of the areas that we need to address. And so one of the things that we have certainly been doing is developing what we call treaty education series, which is information sheets that we provide in collaboration with community. In developing specific things and topics. So to speak to some of those, we have recently developed one that looks at the office name and why we moved away from Aboriginal affairs, using the term Ulnu, understanding that the term Ulnu comes from the root word Nilnu, meaning my tongue, so that we're speaking all the same tongue. And so those information sheets are provided to public service employees at their request. As Celeste has noted, we've also developed that 8-hour Understanding the Treaty Relationship workshop, which essentially addresses the 4 treaty education questions. Who are the Mi'kmaq historically and today? What are treaties and why are they important? What has happened to the treaty relationship? And how do we reconcile our shared history in an equitable and justice way? And so in that regard, in terms of some of the actual stuff that we've done in terms of numbers that I would like to share, is to date, Celeste and I have been able to make contact with over 1,000 public service employees, specifically completing 31 small projects. We have completed 10 presentations, which also includes lunch and learns that we offer. And we also have completed the Understanding the Treaty Relationship in Cairo's Blankets exercise 5 times this fiscal year. And so those are some of the things that we are specifically doing in regards to that call to 57 as it relates to public service employees.
Thank you. Mr. Huston?
Thanks. I'd just like to toot our horn a little bit as well as on this is just, I can tell you from my experience talking with colleagues across definitely Atlantic Canada, we are way out in front on this work. And I can tell you as well from talking to some of our federal colleagues, we are drilling down and we're way more in depth in the level and the quality of training that our public servants are receiving. And we're in some discussions with our federal colleagues as well as our Atlantic province colleagues around how they can learn from some of the work we're doing and or piggyback on some of the work that we're doing here. So I really just want, it's a really opportunity to recognize, I think, the work that's happened in 7 short years, our ability to go from not even having any kind of a treaty education program in place to really being seen as a regional and national leader in the work that we're doing and the way that we're doing it.
MLA White?
Not to put you on the spot, but in reaching out to 1,000 employees, that's a good portion. So have there been any opportunities or challenges that really stand out? If there is, great. If there's not, that's okay.
Ms. Sulliman?
Sure. Yeah. So the great thing about us reaching out is that people are there waiting to take our hand. So we have no problem filling courses, filling seats for the Kairos blanket exercise. We have no problem at all attracting people to lunch and learns. Nick did a lunch and learn just recently with a group, I think, from Justice or Higher Education, and there were 75 people in that learning session alone that he delivered. It was a lunch and learn a couple of weeks ago. So that's really wonderful. It's wonderful to see the responsiveness, and it's wonderful to see people have a real willingness to want to learn and to want to expand their learning. I guess the biggest challenge is capacity. We would love to clone ourselves and each other. We have colleagues all across government who are sharing the load, and who, like Nick and I, have the great privilege to lead some of this work from OLA. We really are, though, the navigators and the facilitators and the relationship builders. There's a whole, slew of people who work collaboratively with us. Without them, we couldn't do the work. But we really would love to, to clone ourselves so that we could double that or triple that. But perhaps the online, creation of an online self-directed learning tool will help with that, and then we can just and we can go from there and build on that.
Thank you. MLA White.
Thank you. I too am a public teacher, public school teacher, so I got to say, when you have your student body showing up, already engaged and involved, 90% of your lessons are delivered. So that's excellent news to hear, for sure. But so one last question before I pass it on to Emily Harrison. In looking at the work of treaty education across the country, there appears to be a strong connection between federal government and the work being done in places like British Columbia, as you mentioned already, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Here in Nova Scotia, it looks like the province and Mi'kmaq have a strong partnership working together, which is great to see. Mr. Huston, you've kind of touched on this already when you mentioned $500,000 to $1 million, but can you describe some of the more in detail the role that the federal government currently has in funding and supporting treaty education in Nova Scotia? Thank you.
Mr. Huston.
Great. So I'll provide a little bit of context of the governance context here to help provide, because there's treaty education in Nova Scotia as an initiative, and then there's broader work that the federal government is doing relative to education, and they're linked, but they're distinct. So it's important to understand that the federal government provides funding to MK, or Mi'kmaq Ginamatnaway, the Mi'kmaq School Authority, for essentially them to run their programs as well as capital for all their schools. And so they have that direct relationship. Our relationship with MK is that we set curriculum outcomes, and as long as the MK helps students reach those curriculum outcomes, they can teach their students however they want, essentially. I'm simplifying it. And so the federal government has a significant role to play in the sense of the work that they do to support MK. When it comes to treaty education specifically, as I mentioned, we're a bit unique here in the sense that in Nova Scotia, it has been primarily a partnership between the province of Nova Scotia and the Mi'kmaq. And the federal involvement has been limited. I would say they've provided some significant project funding. So for some of the work that was required to develop the curriculum outcomes at the P to 12 level. So they provided some specific funding. They provided some other project funding. But we have offered, frankly, to them to say, look, I think there's an opportunity for you to become more involved, and they haven't taken us up on that for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure. But that's kind of fine in some ways, because I think what it's allowed us to do is be very Nova Scotia focused and nimble and adaptable. Whenever you involve the federal government, as you can appreciate, just like we want to have consistency across the province, the feds have this thing around, precedence or consistency across the country. And that can sometimes be more of a hindrance than a help. But I would say is that one of the things, and we bring this up as one of the areas for future collaboration all the time. And personally, it's been a little bit of a bit of a frustration on my end of things that we haven't had as much participation from the federal government in treaty education to date, and something we'll continue to work on.
Thank you, Mr. Houston. MLA White passed it on to his colleague, MLA Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Language Act, extremely important legislation, no question about it. Can you speak a little bit more about the importance of the legislation and what that legislation really going to mean as we move ahead?
Mr. Houston.
Thanks. I'll speak to it maybe from a process or government perspective, but Nick, I might call on you just as a language speaker to kind of speak more from a personal perspective as well. So the calls for the province to do something about language really started coming about 3 years ago. Just pre-COVID, it's around where the federal government started introducing the idea of a Language Act, which they have passed at a federal level. And there was calls provincially to do something similar to show that support. And, the response for the government at the time was, we're interested, but we need more information. Tell us why this is so important and compelling. And so the Mi'kmaq had done some work that they had led themselves around looking at the percentage of language speakers in community. And we're able to show that the trend over the past 10 years is basically like this. Even as population grows in community, the number of speakers, native speakers, or that would say it's their first language, is decreasing. So one number that stands out to me is in Eskasoni, which is the largest Mi'kmaq community in the world, as Chief Leroy likes to say. There's about 5,000 people, just under 5,000 people in the community, and less than 30% are fluent in Mi'kmaq. And that number is dwindling as, knowledge keepers and holders and elders unfortunately pass away, and youth who are very influenced by Western culture and what they see on Netflix and video games to be like, it's not as cool to learn. So there's a real sense of urgency and crisis within the Mi'kmaq community, and they're essentially reached out as partners to say, we know a lot of this work has to happen from within, and we need to be the lead at that as a community, as Mi'kmaq, but what can the province do to work and support that? And so the legislation really provides a sort of enabling framework for the province and the Mi'kmaq to work together in conjunction with what the Mi'kmaq are doing with federal support around how do we work to collectively support Mi'kmaq language across the country, across the province. Some examples of that would be around normalizing the language. If anybody is familiar with New Zealand, has had a chance to travel there, or has seen some of their promotional material, or has seen a start of a rugby match, you will know that Maori language is ubiquitous throughout the country. It is, kia ora is like the hello that's in New Zealand. It is a part of their national identity. And so there's work that we can do here in the province around making it part of our provincial identity. Signage is a great example of some of the things, is another example of things. Looking at ways that we can support MK in teaching language in their schools, the way that we could teach kids in the general public schools words here and there, or language, or Indigenous students or Unu or Mi'kmaq students in schools having support where possible. So again, coming back to, we're waiting to see what the Mi'kmaq Language Implementation Committee is going to come up with in terms of potential actions for the next 1 to 5 years, and then based on that, we'll figure out what our spot is our space is as a government to support the work of the Mi'kmaq in doing that work. And I'll hand it over to Nick now if you want to share a little reflection as well.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Deputy. So Deputy Huston talked about it from a strategic place of understanding, and what I would like to share is it from a cultural sense. And so when we talk about moving forward with this legislation, what does that mean? And it's really understanding and acknowledging what it means to be the first language of this land, in acknowledging that our language is descriptive and distinctive in its use. So it's very different than English. And so by being able to use the language, it allows us the language itself is encoded with the qualities and the understanding of the relationship that we not only have to ourselves, but also the relationship that we have with community and also the natural environment, and knowing that all of these pieces are interconnected. And so when we look at Eskasoni being the largest Mi'kmaq community and seeing that 30% of the language is spoken and only 30% of the language is spoken, that in itself speaks to the urgency of and the reason why revitalization is so important, because language is the key to our identity. And not only to our identity as individual people, but the language itself speaks to the relationship that each and every single one of us as treaty people have to the natural environment.
Order. Thank you.
Thank you.
We now have 10 minutes left per caucus, so we can go back now to the Liberal caucus, and it looks like MLA Nicol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. It's been very informative, and it's interesting as you speak about governance. We were wondering, why are they coming to community services? So that speaks to volumes to the fact that we have to find a permanent way in how you're working the broad portfolio that Mr. Huston has. It speaks to that. So I guess when I want to ask about Section 6 of the House of Assembly Act that declares the House's intention to add a member representing the Mi'kmaq people. And has there been any discussion between the province and the Mi'kmaq representatives on this standing commitment? And also the Act also requires the Premier to hold annual consultations concerning the nature of Mi'kmaq representation in our democracy and to report to the House. So while we know the Premier is no longer responsible for Lineal Affairs, it was something I remember former Premier Dexter brought forward, and subsequent premiers also hold that portfolio, but that is no more. So the Act is quite specific that the Premier must report to the House, and if we could get an update on the status of this reporting and the substance of these conversations as we're having it today, I think it is imperative and so important that we have it in the legislature. So I just wanted to ask about that.
Mr. Huston.
Thank you for that question. So when it comes to, this is an interesting one around the seat in the legislature. So I can't remember when that was passed. I think it was the 80s or early 90s. The idea of ensuring representation, not only from the Mi'kmaq community as well as the African Nova Scotian community. And I can speak from the conversations that happened with Mi'kmaq leaders at the time, and even as recently as a couple months ago, is the initial response back was, essentially, I'll paraphrase here, but thanks but no thanks. We are our own level of government. Right. Order of government, right. We are not going to be sitting in your government. We are a Mi'kmaq nation, or we're our own government, and we have a table for that, and that's our Made in Nova Scotia tripartite negotiation process, as well as other tables, like I referenced earlier, tripartite forum and others. However, the commitment was made and continues to this day that chiefs and cabinet meet on an annual basis. Now that did get messed up with COVID and the inability to meet and priorities being elsewhere, and there was agreement to kind of put that on pause. But as recently as I believe it was June, the cabinet met with all chiefs in Dartmouth to come together for the first time and review, highlight key priorities, and with a plan to meet again this winter. When it comes to reporting in the House, that's an interesting point. I'll have to go back and look at that. That's not something that we've done, but I think it's something certainly that we could do. It has not been something that we've done over the past, since I've been involved, 3 governments. But it's very easy to do, and it's something that we essentially, I'll kind of give you a sense of how these meetings go. It's essentially an opportunity where chiefs and cabinet ministers sort of sit according to their portfolios, and it typically, so they're next to each other, so it's a mixing around the table, and it's a series of conversations around shared priorities. So typically led by our Mi'kmaq leadership around, this issue is very important to us, let's talk about whatever it might be, and the conversation goes from there.
Thank you. MLA Nicol.
And I just wanted to sort of add to that the fact that that's why I say orders of government. I've spoken to a lot of people in the community that I represent and have said, they've asked me, where do you stand on, Mi'kmaq, services and that. And I said, because a lot of people think that Indigenous affairs is a federal matter, and therefore they go to the representative MP to resolve it. But they are, to your point, their own order of government. So I even say provincially we're an order of government. And in that regard, I just wanted to say in closing that how we facilitate this conversation is what's integral to the success of the work that you're doing. So if there's anything, that we could work towards, as I referenced earlier, I would love to sort of arrange something within the work that I'm trying to do in the riding. So I just will now pass it on to Mr. Jessam.
MLA Jessam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back to the line of questioning around service delivery and how the work around Mi'kmaq language helps to facilitate service delivery. Perhaps, Mr. Huston, can you speak specifically to hiring and recruiting from the perspective of meeting people where they're at, ensuring that government reflects, that people see themselves reflected in the staff and leadership in our government?
Mr. Huston.
Thanks for that. I'll answer your question. I want to provide, if I can, a little bit of context as well to that. So it's important to realize that, I'll go back to what I said earlier, the work that we're doing in language, the work that we're doing in treaty education, again, I would call that sort of the foundational level of work that's happening that supports more detailed work that's happening in departments. So, for example, the work that's happening with health around Dajigamik, the Mi'kmaq Health Authority, and the conversations around that, or the initial, the conversations that are starting now between the Mi'kmaq federal government and the province around social income assistance on reserves. So those are conversations that are happening in a very real way that relate to service delivery. And the work that we do is around raising, I would say, the bar of public servants around their ability to enter into those conversations from a different place than they might have been prior to receiving any of the treaty education work. When it comes to recruitment, retention, there's a lot of work that's underway within the PSC as well as across departments around. So I'd say there's kind of two ways that are happening around that. One is around specific creation of recognizing the importance of this relative to certain programs and services, is the creation of specific new roles that may be either designated positions, so that it is designated because they can show that it's critical for that person to be Ulnu or Mi'kmaq or Indigenous, depending on the type of program of service, for the success of that service delivery or that program. In other cases, it may not be designated, but it may have very strong emphasis on having a connection to community or the work of community. And then there's broader work that's happening around all positions across government, changing the way that we're looking at ways of qualifications. Why have we gone down this road of requiring a master's degree for an entry-level position? Like, we need to be recognized where people are at, and people bring other abilities and skills other than just a post-secondary diploma when they might bring other value to a position. It's also looking at our interview processes. So there's also some cultural competencies around how we interview, and the way that we tend to formally structure some of these interviews very much is biased towards folks that are either already in the system or already know how that kind of Western, here's how you're going to have to compete, make sure you hit all these points. And the other part, like very practical sense, is when there is anybody that is from the Indigenous community applying, we work to ensure that on the interview panel itself, there's someone else from the Indigenous community there as well that can provide that lived experience and that perspective. So those are some examples of some of the things that we're doing, and there's a real concerted effort across, not just for Indigenous communities, but all underrepresented groups in government, because we know that government needs to do better at reflecting all Nova Scotians.
Thank you. Emily Jessam, you have 1 minute.
One?
One.
You go ahead here.
We'll move on to the NDP Caucus. MLA Burrow.
Thank you. Look, I would just like to say first that I found, Mr. Phillips, what you said about the urgency of language revitalization to be very compelling. And I would like to ask a political question. So, about the TRC, in our party, it has seemed, it does now, to us, that the most authentic and comprehensive response we could make as a government in Nova Scotia would be to commit ourselves formally as a government to the implementation of those calls that are within the provincial jurisdiction, and then to set up, as we do in other things about which we're serious, sets of targets, as we often do, say, in healthcare or in energy policy, that we would set up a reporting mechanism, understanding that some of the calls are very complex, some of them not so much. That we would set up a reporting mechanism by which the government would be able to say, here is where we are this year on moving towards these calls. So, as you know, the legislation that we've brought forward to this effect has not advanced. But I want to ask your opinions. Does this seem or not seem like a valuable framework for moving forward with the milestone of the TRC?
Mr. Huston.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's certainly so to back up a little bit with the TRC, with the calls to action. So we do track every single action, all 94, but particularly those. I think there's 54 or 45. I always flip it. 45 or 54 that relate either directly or indirectly to the provincial government's role. And so we have an evergreen document where we're tracking that on I would say a monthly or bi-monthly basis around progress that's being made. Now, some of those, like I mentioned, I would call sort of some of the low-hanging fruit, or at least more short-term, like the ability to waive the fee for name changes for anybody involved in the 60 scoop or et cetera. Some of the other ones I would say are it's on a spectrum, are generational in change, and the progress will take quite a while because it took 400 years of colonization here to get to where we are, and there's going to be. So I think I know in the past when parties have asked to see a progress update, we provided that to I think some researchers within your party. So we're very open to it. And I think we are able to show that we've made quite significant progress in a lot of areas. And like I said, other areas are going to be a bit more challenging. But it's certainly something to consider. It's something I'll bring up with the minister around some sort of annual reporting on the TRC.
MLA Burrow.
Yes. Did either of you wish to speak? Yeah.
My apologies. Ms. Sulliman.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to speak to quantifying the progress and the calls to action. As Deputy Huston said, that there are quite a few calls to action that impact the provincial government in particular. And one of the challenges that we always have difficulty with is quantifying our success, because we can speak about our success in terms of, as Nick did earlier, about the numbers of people that we're reaching, engaging in the learning, the number of people who participate in Kairos blanket exercises, the number of documents that we create. But really, I think the way that we, Nick and I, approach treaty education, and I think that this is present in the perspective of our colleagues as well, is that we really try to take a qualitative approach to measuring the success of treaty education. So when I think back to 15 years ago when I started in government, I can tell you that government looked very different than it does today, 15 years later. And it's not just because I see maybe more Olno or Indigenous people working in government, but the conversations are different. The tone is different. The process of engagement is different. The focus is different. And so those are some qualitative aspects that really can't be measured in the same way that, we can just quantify things. I do see a shift in the way that the provincial government is heading. Even the fact that we're here, that you invited us here to this committee, speaks volumes for for the attention that is being given to both Mi'kmaq language and to treaty education.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Okay, MLA Burrow.
Thank you. So I just wanted to be clear that the issue isn't tracking. The issue is lifting up the framework by public reporting, and I have failed to understand why the government has not felt that this would advance the moment of the TRC. To elevate it to the level that we give to things that we say this is important, so important we report publicly on. Exactly. That's the key point I think that is contained in our proposal, which has, as I see it, not yet been addressed. So that's if I just. So I don't know if you wanted to respond to that point. I guess you've already spoken some to it. Yeah. Yeah. So. Good.
Sure.
Great.
Like you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
I'd like to go back to something you said when you were speaking about the tripartite forum, just as an illustration of things. You were talking about the issue of the monument, or you mentioned it as a thing. I think it's an important thing that I think the recommendation was that every capital city in the country shall have a monument to residential school survivors. Where are we in Nova Scotia on this?
Mr. Huston.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a question that we get now and then. So it's important to realize that a monument towards the residential school is not always seen. So we're following the lead of community on this, and there's work that's happening at the tripartite forum around framing recommendations about a path forward on this. Whether it's at the former residential school site in Sibignaggity or it's here in the capital city, it's important to realize that there's a lot of sensitivity around a monument and what that means for different people. There is not consensus. Further to some of our previous comments around, the Mi'kmaq community and communities not being homogeneous, not everybody agrees where it should be, what it should look like, if there should even be one, because it could be triggering to people and communities. So essentially, we are respectful of that relationship and that partnership, and we are ready when the work is done and recommendations come forward and there is a sense from community of, yes, this is what we think is the best thing and how to proceed. We will be ready to be there in partnership with our Mi'kmaq partners.
A minute 30.
Thank you.
MLA Burrow, my apologies.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
I don't want to let this chance go by without speaking to that key recommendation from the TRC about the reducing the number of Indigenous children in care and developing a reporting mechanism on where the province is on improving this. Where are we on having statistics and figures about the trajectory we're on this call?
Mr. Huston, 1 minute.
I know we're limited for time. I will paraphrase by saying I don't have the exact stats on that, but there is a lot of work that's happening both at the Department of Community Services and with Mi'kmaq Children and Family Services, which is sort of a partnership between DCS and Mi'kmaq leadership. And there are also discussions around the development of a Mi'kmaq-led Children and Family Services model. So that is something that we can report back to in terms of the status of that to the committee. I'll talk to my colleague at DCS around that.
Thank you. We will now move on to the Progressive Conservative Caucus with MLA Taggart.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. I just let's stray just a little bit here because mental health's been a passion of mine forever, and so I just want to ask a little bit about. So this is leans in that direction. So can you what kind of investments have we made in young people and with the Micmac? So I want you to tell me a little bit about the Micmac Native Friendship Center in the Chair's riding, actually, or the Everyone Every Day project in Halifax, or even the Eskasoni Crisis and Referral Center. I don't want to just to go by without bringing mental health into it. Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Huston.
Thanks. So not surprisingly, I think everybody around the table would recognize that mental health and wellness is probably emerging as one of the most biggest priority issues in Nova Scotia and in healthcare. And we're not unique. It's across the country, coming out of a very difficult time for many. And that is certainly the case within Mi'kmaq communities as well. I think it's something that I hear on a regular basis when I'm talking with chiefs, that I hear other colleagues as well, is that mental health and addictions is one of the biggest issues. So I think there's a lot of work that's happening, that has happened previously and is continuing to build on within community with government. And so I think it's very important to, again, I'll come back to, is where we try to meet our partners on this is that it's community-led or Mi'kmaq-led, and that government provides that support where it can in terms of feeding into local solutions and approach. So we've got, the Eskasoni Crisis Line, or the work that they're doing in community, and we look at ways that we can support that, or whether it's at the Friendship Center in terms of direct program delivery, partnering with Office of Mental Health and Addictions or DCS around some of the program delivery. Many folks don't know, but the current temporary Mi'kmaq Friendship Center space is the province is providing that rent for until a new facility is built. So we're covering that whole new facility that's located off of Brunswick. So that's an example of some of the work that we are doing. But I want to just emphasize it is a growing concern amongst our First Nation partners and leadership around the state of mental health and addictions in community.
Thank you. MLA Barkhouse.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could share with the committee what type of resources are available for employees, and for that matter, even non-for-profits, because, for example, my Chester Playhouse burnt down a few years ago, and they're rebuilding. They're going to add some information in for them and for employers that wish to incorporate treaty education and awareness in their space, I guess would be. Yeah. Mr. Houston.
Mr. Houston.
So this is a common question that I think Celeste and Nick field on a regular basis, and it's speaking to some of the question earlier around some of the from MLA White around some of the challenges, and what has changed, I would say, in particularly last 5 years, is that we've gone from a place of really trying to kind of knock on people's doors and raise the awareness that this is something that's important, they should pay attention to fielding, all the knocks that we're having on our door of, hey, this is really important to us, we need help. And I think that speaks to something of a level of awareness that people have, which I think is very important, and it's to recognize as a positive, is that people have an awareness that there are sensitivities about ways to do this, and they want to do it right, and they want to do the right thing. And so they will often come to us and say, hey, look, we're rebuilding this facility, or we're doing this program in our community, and we'd really like to have a Mi'kmaq element to this. What do we do? Who do we talk to? Or sometimes the question is, can you send an elder to my event? So a lot of the work is actually stepping back a little bit from that and saying, okay, so let's say it's the Chester area. Let's figure out to have the Chester Playhouse get in touch with Acadia First Nation and start to build a relationship at the staff level Or we might say, you know what, we know an elder down on the South Shore that might be great to come to that event or to work with you on some of that stuff. Because what we're careful about with the treaty education is that we don't hold the information or the knowledge. We're a conduit to folks in community that can help provide that. And, you know, if you asked someone from Acadia First Nation, a knowledge holder, an elder, and you ask someone from Member 2, you might get a different answer because it's a different region of the province, a different community, different history. And so it's very important to make those local connections. And kind of like what I said something earlier is that it's important for organizations and groups to think of it, having the sign is the product. And you could get that pretty easily. But the value comes in the process and the journey to get that sign in the Playhouse. And the relationship that you're building by working in community, and then that's what's going to last longer than. And so I think that's kind of some of the work that we do is actually help set the folks at the Chester Playhouse in touch with folks in community to then start that dialogue. And that sometimes is just the seed, and then from there grows a whole other series of relationships and projects.
Thank you. MLA Barkos with 3:45 left.
Okay, well, I thought that was a great answer. The 231 calls for justice in the 2019 final report on the National Inquiry Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, has required that all levels of government and Indigenous organizations work together on how best to move forward. And I'd like to know what has been done here in Nova Scotia. I think everybody's got a little thing here happening with their voice. What are some of the steps that Nova Scotia is taking in regards to this?
Mr. Huston?
Thanks for that question. Great to weave that in. So there are a lot of calls to justice that are cross-cut with the TRC calls, and obviously we're working on that. But I would say that the process that we're following is not unlike the process we followed around working with Mi'kmaq leadership around prioritizing the calls to action in the TRC, around the calls to justice for the MMIWG inquiry. So we have worked closely leading up through the process of the inquiry, the national inquiry, working with Status of Women, our office, and really following the leadership of the Mi'kmaq, in particular women leadership, around how they would like to participate in the inquiry. We put families first and how to welcome the commission, how to have it be a wraparound for communities and families that would participate when it was held in Member 2. And then in response to the calls to action, we participated in all the national committees that were involved in sort of creating this. We are again following the lead of Mi'kmaq leadership around helping us prioritize of those 231 what are all as relevant in Nova Scotia as they might be in other parts of the country, and some are much larger priorities here than other places. So COVID again kind of stalled some of that work. We're really waiting for the leadership, Mi'kmaq leadership, to identify, to come say, here's how we'd like to approach this and come together. But I would say one of the key things that we've done is answer the call for the Native Women's Resiliency Center. So both federal government and the province provided funding for this resiliency center, which is already broken ground in Millbrook, and will be a center not only for, it will be a cultural center for women in a safe place to assist women that might be fleeing domestic violence, but also there's a maker space that's underway so people can start to create crafts that can have economic return to their families, as well as a cultural center that will be women first, women focused. So that's an example of some of the concrete things, but again, we're kind of waiting to follow the lead of our Mi'kmaq partners.
Thank you very much. 40 seconds if you want to make a closing remark. MLA Barkos.
I would like to thank all of you for being here. You really gave us some great information to work with, and you definitely know what you're doing in your job. So I'm going to speak for us and hopefully everybody that we really truly appreciate your time and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I just asked if any of the witnesses had some closing remarks they would like to share. Mr. Huston?
Sure. I'll just provide just a very brief and high-level remark here. I just kind of wrote a couple notes down. First, I just want to thank you again for the invitation to come here. I think partly we were kind of questioning, like, oh, we're going to this committee. What's the connection? I think, MLA Jessam, but, we really relish the opportunity to highlight the work that we're doing. We think it's very important. It's foundational to the work of this committee and making Nova Scotia a better place for future generations. One of the things that we like to say is we are helping to educate our future leaders. So if you think of folks in this room and the age that we're at, maybe Nick notwithstanding, but what we learned in school is not the full history, is not our shared knowledge of this province. And it's very difficult, adult education is something else, and we're doing our best to learn, but when you have it woven into starting at grade 5, grade 6, and understanding what it means to have a friendship, what it means to have an agreement, a treaty, elements of culture and heritage woven into, I will be very excited 20 years from now when some of these young people are our leaders, and if the tone of conversation has changed in the past 5 or 10 years, imagine what it's going to be like in 20 years. And that's where our vision is, and that's what we're looking forward with our partners. And on that note, I just want to say, I think, and spend the tone of some of the questions and conversation around the table today, is I would really encourage you in your roles as MLAs, as leaders in your community, to be looking at ways that you can help champion this work and being that facilitator and that connector. You are in a unique position. You have the respect of people in your community. You have the respect of the Indigenous community as well. And everybody, there's certain things that everybody, I think, we can get behind. Language and treaty education are some of those things. And I think you're very well poised to help us in our journey and help us bring the message to the province. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did either of you have any comments you'd like to share? No? Okay. Well, we do have some committee business, but again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedules to come today, and thank you for the excellent work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing it progress. So you can carry on about your day, and we will get to our 2 minutes. We'll call a 2-minute recess. Okay, order. I call the meeting back to order. So at this point, we will go over some committee business. The first on the agenda is the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission Progress Report for spring 2021 and August 2022 was shared with the committee by Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs. I'm just asking at this point if there's any discussion on that report. And if there's no discussion, we have the consent of the committee members to have it posted on the Nova Scotia Legislature website. Agreed. Okay, and the next item on the agenda is the request to appear from the Face of Poverty Coalition. This was not discussed at the last meeting, so I would suggest that we revisit the topic at a later agenda setting meeting, considering the topics have already just quite literally been set. And when we do the next agenda setting, perhaps let's move requests for requests that come in during the course of the agenda that's been set, that they get appear on the agenda setting as motions so that they can get considered at part of the agenda setting process as per the rules of the committee. Is there any discussion on that? Sounds good. Okay. And then finally, we have the request from the committee. Just wanted an item of noting, request from the committee to the Department of Health and Wellness to provide a written briefing regarding the assertive treatment program. And I just wanted to let the committee members know that this has been sent out and we are just awaiting the response for that. I guess there wouldn't be a discussion on that. We'll discuss it when it comes forward. So then we'll move on to the next meeting is scheduled for January the 10th because of the holidays, 2023. The topic is the impact of the cost of living crises on vulnerable Nova Scotians and those living on income assistance. Witnesses will be the Department of Community Services, Feed Nova Scotia, Shebecto Connections, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia, and Nourish Nova Scotia. And since that concludes committee business, I would say that if there isn't anything further, the meeting is adjourned.